The New Orleans Conference, the world's greatest investment event.
And now we come to an important part of our program, which is sobering, and at the same time, a great celebration of a great man, Charles Krauthammer. I'd like to welcome up to our podium Brian London, the director of this great conference over the last 20 years. James Carville here from New Orleans, who was on a couple or maybe 3 panels with Charles Krauthammer. Jonah Goldberg, whom you heard from this morning, that's been on panels with Charles, Washington, D.C. area. And Jason Smith, who is personal assistant to Charles Krauthammer for the last 18 years. They can come on right up here, gentlemen. Charles Krauthammer was not given his biblical 70, just fell short of that. I also want to honor another man in a wheelchair who made this whole program possible. That's James U. Blanchard III, who would have turned 75 next week. He had his last conference here 20 years ago in 1998. Margaret Thatcher was invited here. Jim died the following March. And in his will, he willed this conference to his intellectual heir, the editor of Gold Newsletter, Brian London, who has continued Jim's legacy with this conference. So I want to start out this tribute to Charles Krauthammer with Brian London and ask you, Brian, what did you see in Charles Krauthammer for these political debates that began about a decade ago, and you invited Charles for the conservative side of the conservative versus libertarian debates. What did you see in Charles? And more importantly, what did Charles see in us, and why did he want to keep coming back to be with us? Brian?
Well, what I saw in Charles, I think, is easy. Everybody saw the same thing. You saw a giant intellect in someone who could reason and think out his words and not speak for effect or claim or shock value, but for that kind of intellectual, he would translate his intellectual energy, he fed off of that. But what I discovered off of Charles, and it really didn't hit me until started to hit me when he announced that his disease was terminal. And it really hit me after he passed, and it's hitting me again during this conference. You know, I have had the pleasure to meet a lot of fairly famous people because of this event. And, you know, you pay them, send them a check, and they meet you in the green room and shake your hands, take a picture, and that's pretty much it. And, you know, a number of those people over the many years have passed, and you say, you know, darn, that's a shame. I remember meeting them, they were a nice person. As I wrote after Charles passed in one of our, or actually right before he had passed in one of our letters, Charles was different, you know. A lot of people were eulogizing him before he passed and afterwards, and were really good friends of his. And I felt I had to write something about my experiences, and I did. And I said, you know, I started writing it as if he was a friend. And I said, you know, I really can't claim that. I saw the man once a year. Once a year I saw him. Yet every time I saw him, he greeted me as a friend. And I felt a grief when he passed, a real sense of grief. And it's hitting me again today, as if he was a very close friend. And again, I met the man once a year. And in speaking with a number of you since and at this event, a number of you felt the same way. Some of you never bothered him as, of course, it wasn't a bother for Charles, but a number of you didn't go up and talk to him in the hallway and take pictures with him. A number of you did, but you all felt a personal attachment to him, and you all felt the same way, and you feel that same pang of grief as if a close friend had passed. And yet, we vast majority of us only saw the man once a year, interacted with him only briefly, but he had that effect on people. And the shame is that so many people, only a small fraction of people who ever met Charles or saw him speak, and most of them in this room or attending this conference, got to see that side of him, got to see him relaxed and the banter and the humor and the good nature that Charles really exhibited in person, but didn't quite do it because of the time limitations and the particular setups of television. So we were very fortunate. And because he passed, we feel a personal loss. Even again, we didn't only had a superficial interaction with him. We all feel a personal loss. But to me, that loss is great for us, but there's a greater loss, and that's the loss for intelligent discourse in modern humanity. It's a loss for the world, and it's a crying shame. I tell you, we will not, the analysis, the intelligence that we will not hear from now on, it's a loss to the world. It really is.
The way we began using Charles was in a three-way debate politically. Later on, we used Charles in something called the Summit for America's Future. But early on, we tried to pit a liberal and a conservative and a libertarian. The libertarians were usually Doug Casey or P.J. O'Rourke. And it was easy to find conservatives. This is a basically conservative crowd. But it was the courageous person was always the liberal. I remember one debate between Susan Estrich and Ann Coulter. But the most memorable was Charles Krauthammer versus James Carville. And could we run clip number 1 here? We have 3 film clips to run. Clip number 1.
James. Well, first of all, I appreciate my role here as the fire plug at the dog show. And also, let me say this.
Allow me to lift my leg.
Let me say this.
If you didn't catch that, Charles Krauthammer interrupted after he said fire plug. Charles said, then allow me to lift my leg. So James, tell us about your experiences with Charles.
Well, first of all, I'm walking in a hotel and this woman comes up to me and says, well, James, we're going to have a parade of Democrats in your honor, but my husband got sick and I didn't want to march by myself, so there we are. I think the real telling thing, about Charles is the world is full of people that tell you how to live. Charles Krauthammer actually showed you how to die, which is a real show of strength, of character, of everything else. And he was I guess Charles, to be honest with you, one of the things that he was really well known for was his handicap. But the thing about him was, as soon as you sat at the table, you didn't even notice it. You were just having a debate. You were having a debate with, a really sharp, clever, well-read, well-thought-out guy, and you just never, anybody else, you would have said, I got to take something off my pitch. But with Charles, you said, I got to add it. I got to load up here. And that's a unique, and you have that kind of characteristic where you had the kind of life that Charles had, in a very public life, and you never had an iota of sympathy for him. He never wanted you to have it. And the fact that, his death was public, and he wrote about it, and he dealt with it, which is just the ultimate kind of Charles Krauthammer thing. There's just not very many people that you run across that have that kind of dignity, that kind of class, and that kind of, he was a physician, so he was very familiar with life cycles. And I just thought, in many ways, he was maybe he was clearly one of the most remarkable people I've known, and he's, one of the great public intellectuals of modern American history, honestly. I could think of a couple I would throw in with him, but not very many. And that's quite a role. You're talking about honoring a guy who was extraordinary, did extraordinary things, and had an extraordinary life. And I'm just delighted that you would ask me to participate in it.
I'd like to piggyback off what James said. I was Charles's personal assistant, helped him with all of his travels for the last 18, 19 years of his life. Met him in my freshman year in college and continued on until the end. And there's a story that captures what you're saying about his handicap, is One day, Charles and I were at a hotel, the Breakers, down in Florida, and we're about to go to a speech. And the mirror was from the floor to the ceiling where we were waiting for the elevator. And Charles stops and he looks at himself and he goes, Jason, you know, I'm so busy and so focused on my life, I sometimes forget this is how I look. And that is what James captured right there is you didn't throw Charles that pitch because he didn't throw the pitch to himself. He never looked at his paralysis as anything more than an afterthought. It didn't consume his thoughts throughout the day. It was just something that he was dealt in life, and he said, okay, and he kept doing what he wanted to do and his passions in life. But he didn't allow that to overcome him. And like James said, that's so fascinating because of the level that he went and took things, and to not allow that at all to become part of the conversation after he made a credible thought. The conversation after Charles spoke was what Charles spoke about. It wasn't about Charles Krauthammer. I just want to quickly say as to how we got James here today, and then I'll let Mr. Goldberg say some thoughts. About 7 years ago, I come into the green room backstage with Brian London, and I said, man, I had one of the best plane rides of my entire life last night. I said, Charles debated James Carville yesterday in Virginia, and after the debate, because James could not get a direct flight to New Orleans, and Charles had private aircraft arranged for him so he could get here for the event the next day, offered James a flight home, because as you know, Charles is good friends with James's wife, as you could imagine. So we get on the plane that night, and it was just absolutely fascinating, the conversation that they had, the funny things that they had, but also what it really came down to. When they got on the plane, Charles asked James, why did you choose to go to New Orleans? Why did you choose to go back home instead of staying in Washington where you had it made in the shade, could send your kids to the best schools, so on and so forth? And James replied, there's no civic duty in Washington. This was shortly after Katrina. James thought it was better to be in New Orleans. And James and Charles just talked about life, raising their family, raising their kids. And that's the one thing that not many people got to see about Charles, was how complete of a person he was. Like Brian said, he really genuinely wanted to be your friend. And if he did not respect you, he would not shake your hand and he would not be your friend. So I think there's a lot to be said about Charles Krauthammer outside of his political views and just the total character of who he was as a man.
In James' opening statement about Charles' death, I want to share with you that I did not know that he was so sick, and when Brian said he might be coming to the 2017 conference and did not, I didn't know until Charles wrote this letter just a few days before he died how sick he was. And when I read that letter, the immediate vision I got was Lou Gehrig standing in Yankee Stadium, saying, I'm the luckiest man alive, because he was the Iron Man, Lou Gehrig. And Charles's letter was so profound. It was just like Lou Gehrig's speech about his beautiful family, and I lived the life I intended. It's such a beautiful letter. I hope you all read it.
I have one more thing to inform you, just so you are all aware of what the result was of the debate when Charles debated James. So Charles debates James that day. That night, there was a dinner, and at the dinner, the MC stands up and says at the mic, I'm in the back corner of the room, nowhere near Charles. They said, Charles will not be joining us for dinner today. He ate James for lunch. So that will give you an idea as to how it went.
Now before I introduce...
I would hesitate that was at Liberty Unit, no, at Pat Robinson's place. I always gave Charles home field advantage.
Now, before I introduce Jonah, I'm going to introduce the second clip, but with a little bit of an introduction. We had a debate, I think it was 2013. The conservative was Wayne Allen Root, slick back hair, evangelist for the right, and the left-winger was Fred Kaplan from Slate, professorial-looking, tousled hair, and they got into such a debate I had to separate them like in a wrestling ring. And Charles was kind of the outsider, so listen to Charles' retort in one of these clips. Clip number 2.
Well, I'm kind of stunned. I'd say I agree with about 80% of what Charles said.
Well, then I retract all of it.
Next question.
Is this a private fight, or can anybody join? Well, I'm sorely tempted to refute what Fred said, but I will exercise tremendous restraint because I really want to do Wayne instead, if you'll permit me.
I mean, I think you hit all the buttons, and you're exactly right of all the flaws of this candidate.
You can stop right there.
So Charles is the master of one-liners as well as great paragraphs of thought. So Jonah, tell us about your experience with Charles.
Oh, sure. So I've lived in Washington since 1991, 92. And I knew his research assistant back then. I actually knew a couple of his research assistants, but I never really knew the man himself, and I never really realized how handicapped he was until I started being on a special report with him on Bret Baier's show, and you really realize just how, lots of people knew he was in a wheelchair, but he was truly, truly disabled, and you never could really appreciate it until you saw how the production assistant on the set would have to bring him a glass with a straw because he couldn't hold one up to drink for himself. And the thing about Charles, who I got to be very good friends with for the last 10 years or so, is that he's sort of a weird study in contrasts. On the one hand, you can't, he had said many times that the only way he could have survived what happened to him was to be absolutely honest with himself, that there was no going back. His life was going to be in this chair for the rest of his life, and he couldn't feel sorry for himself. And I always thought there was a certain analog to that in the way he thought about everything else. He was fiercely realistic about how the world works, about how life works, about politics and international relations. And that's the part that we usually saw on television or in print, was this sort of piercing, cutting through the BS kind of intellect. But the thing that you saw when he was off camera was he was a mensch. I'm not a big baseball guy, but I always knew that the Nationals were playing because when Charles showed up at Fox and he was chewing gum and he had a grin from one ear to the other, it meant he was leaving immediately from the show to go see a Nationals game. And one of the things I always try to impress on interns when I give these little talks about Washington and whatnot is always, there's this distinction that people make between living your life so that at the end of your life you have a great resume, or living your life so that at the end of your life you have a great eulogy. Resume is a bunch of positions and accomplishments and awards. A eulogy are the stories that people tell about you that say how much you meant to them and how much you'll miss them. And Charles amazingly lived his life to the fullest on both fronts. And, I've got funny stories about what a sweet guy he was, but the one that sort of moved me the most, because I didn't know it at all until after he died, was General Keane, who's a great guy. You see him on Fox a lot. He tells the story about how he asked Charles to speak to a young soldier who was horribly wounded in Afghanistan. Basically had the same kind of injuries that Charles did. And he said, I don't know if you do this kind of thing. And Charles said, I don't think a month has gone by in the last 30 years where I haven't counseled people in these kinds of situations. And he says, the thing you always have to tell them is you have to own this. Maybe there'll be some miracle breakthrough, but you cannot get to that point in your life unless you own who you are and move forward as if this is who you're going to be for all time. You cannot have self-pity. And that was the thing that always struck me about Charles, is that of all of the people you meet in Washington, all the people on this panel, we can all have our moments of self-pity. He deserved his moments of self-pity more than anybody I can think, and he never indulged in it. He just saw the world as clearly as he could, and he was happy for what he had. He brimmed with gratitude. And so when you watch Charles on TV, you would think he's this incredibly intimidating guy. Turns out that guy is actually George Will. Because Charles was actually this very gregarious, fun guy. He was also, one last sort of point I'll make is, and I used to joke with him about this all the time. When I used to watch Special Report all the time, the natural reaction is, gosh, I wish they gave Krauthammer more time. And then you actually would get on the panel with him, and you'd be like, man, this bastard filibusters. And we used to joke about that all the time. My mom, her proudest things about me as a pundit were always whenever or not I would make Krauthammer laugh. And I always tried to do it right before he went up. And I remember at one point, we were talking about the Obamacare website failures, and I said some line about how no one could have predicted that the Obama administration would have hired the best Amish computer programmers their community could provide. And he lost it. And he afterwards during commercial break goes, you got me.
Yeah.
And so I thought he was just a remarkable, remarkable guy, and it's one of the things I'm most grateful for that I got to be friends with him.
Jonah, I'm sure everybody's curious of how you met Charles Krauthammer and what he's done for your career over the years, how he mentored you.
Well, I met him around Washington because it was hard to avoid, but I first started seeing him on a regular basis at Fox in the green room. And we would talk, we would conspire, and we would gossip. He loved to gossip. Not in a mean way. He just always was interested in what was going on. And for me, by the time I got to know him, my career was pretty well established. But what he was incredibly useful for was bucking up. The 2016, 2015 period for people who were not getting on board the Trump train was a very difficult time. And to have Charles as sort of this guy who called him like you saw him, he praised Trump when he thought it was worthwhile, but Charles was constitutionally and intellectually immune from undue enthusiasm about anything. And that was incredibly reassuring. And it was a huge loss, I think, because I think conservatism these days is being corrupted from a whole bunch of pressures, and it's particularly intellectual conservatism. And we could use Charles Krauthammer now, whether you agreed with him or not, just for the manner and seriousness of the way he thought about things, we could use him a great deal now. And other than that, we just argued about history stuff whenever we saw each other.
Can I make a point here?
Sure.
It's going to be a little bit crude, but I can't think of another way to say it. I can't tell you Charles was the smartest person I knew. I can certainly tell you he was one of them. I can't tell you that he's the best debater I've ever seen or been against, but I can clearly tell you that he's one of them. There's one superlative about Charles that I will say, and it's this. He is the most unfull of shit person I ever knew. Okay? He didn't bullshit himself, or you, or anybody else. I mean, he had, and I know it's crude, but I just cannot think of a better way to put it. He did not, and like you said, if he didn't like you, you kind of knew it.
Right.
And if he liked you, then you were his friend.
Right.
But the only way that you were going to, to be honest, it was a level, I wouldn't say of arrogance about Charles, but he wasn't going to be friendly with you unless you had something to say.
Right.
Or you had something to bring to the table, which is understandable. I tell my students that. Your goal in life is to always be the dumbest person in the room. If you're in a room and you're the smartest person, get out, because you're not going to learn anything. But Charles was just, I'm telling you, he never, and he had in a city that floats on shit.
Yeah.
Okay? He was the most, and I was thinking, I can think of some people I think are smart as Charles. I can think of some people I think is good, but I cannot think of anybody more straightforward. I could have said straightforward, but I wouldn't have gotten the point in the same way. I just really think that's something that's right.
And you're right about that. His son Daniel, his eulogy, and Charles is a very private person, so I don't want to speak too much about this, but Charles loved movies. He loved cinema. And in the last month of his life, one of the movies that he watched more often than others was the movie Lawrence of Arabia. And there's a line in Lawrence of Arabia in which he says, "My friends know my name." And that's what Daniel talked about, and James is talking about now, after Charles passed, was even if you only saw him once a year, you knew you were Charles's friend. He put it out there, and you actually felt that. So James, you're exactly right. And he didn't care about being with the who's who of Washington and being invited to all the different dinners. Years ago, he went to the press club dinner, and he gets home that night, and he goes, I'm never going to a press club dinner again. It's really big in Washington. All the celebrities show up, so on and so forth. He goes, it will not get any better than it got for me tonight. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, Kim Kardashian shows up, and all of the paparazzi start chasing her down to get a picture of her, and they end up accidentally stampeding Ariana Huffington. It's never getting any better for me. I'm not going again. And that was Charles. I mean, he was so simple, but so funny. And I mean, the whole entire night, all I'm envisioning is Kim Kardashian at the Kennedy Center and Ariana Huffington just getting by paparazzi. And he was simple, but it was funny. And you know what? He never went to another one of those events again. He really didn't.
Been to the mountaintop, right?
But I would also like to, he asked me how I met Charles and discuss my introduction and when I started working for Charles, and it sort of supports everything we're talking about. He did not throw his weight around. I was a freshman, and I was partying a lot my freshman year of college, like most of us do, and I literally suffer from Catholic guilt. And I said, I better start doing something to even this out, or I'm going to fail out of college. So I see in the newspaper a job to go help a disabled man with his evening duties, Monday through Friday, 10 o'clock at night. I said, that's perfect. I go out to the bars around 11:30. I work from him from 10 to 11, and that's it. So I get on the metro, go to downtown D.C., and show up for this job. And there is a line of people outside the door and down the hallway. And when I walk into his office, this is how much I knew about Charles. I walk into this office and I see Charles and I said, man, whatever this guy does for a living, he must be pretty good at it because he has a huge office. I didn't even know who Charles was. I ended up giving him the priest that was of my local parish as a recommendation, so he knew I had no clue who he was. And he ended up offering me the job. And the way that I found out who Charles was it was 2 weeks later in the dead of winter, and there was a snowstorm in Washington, D.C. Calls me up at 6 o'clock in the morning and says, Jason, I need you to come to my house and help me right now. And I said, Charles, I got class at 8 o'clock in the morning. I can't come right now. He goes, I'll write you a note. I have to be at the White House for a meeting. And I'm like, what? So I go to his house, help Charles out, and I get back and I Google Charles Krauthammer. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I called up my dad and said, Dad, have you ever heard of Charles Krauthammer? And he goes, get out of here. And I said, well, that's the man I'm helping. And my dad jokes around that he hasn't had to pay for a drink at the VFW since. So, I mean, that's Charles Krauthammer. He didn't say, this is who I am and this is who you're working for. It was more, can you serve me and do I think you're going to fit? And I just always loved that about him. He didn't make it about what he had done. It was about what we're going to do. And that's one of the most important things in life, so.
All I'll say is, as an MC, I had to listen to what he had to say, and I know he couldn't burst in like many debaters can. He took time to breathe, and I had to, because most people, when you breathe in a debate, that means that's your chance to interrupt. But, he thought in terms of paragraphs, and I had to give him time. And I think Charles and I, by the end, worked out some winking system, and he let me know when he was about ready to finish. But the most dramatic thing, besides the lifting his leg there, in a debate was when he proposed the entitlement solution, raise the age of retirement, tort reform, and means testing for Social Security. Boy, Dick Armey stood up with his cowboy boots to his 6'3" frame and says, that's fraud. If a private, pension firm did that, they would go to jail for that. And Charles says, that's the solution. It's a tax like any other tax. We got to do it. And those are the kinds of ideas Charles had that would probably work. It would raise hackles in Washington. It's the third rail, but it would probably work. Charles had those ideas. They were wonderful ideas. They were worth entertaining, but Washington won't do it. That was my experience. We're going to run a final tape in a minute, but before we do it, because I think Charles' final tape should be our final word. So let's, any final words anyone else wants to say before we close the panel about working with Charles over the last few years?
I'd like to say one thing, and we covered, I think, the most significant aspects of Charles's personality. What a kind and genuine person he was. But just one thought on his intellect. I disagreed on a number of issues with Charles. But in talking these things over, or hearing Charles on these various issues, talking it over with Charles, the man had such a way of presenting a sound, coherent argument. Like you say, he thought in paragraphs. He didn't have the luxury, which I think is a handicap for most of us, of being able to type something out and then delete it and then say, how else can I express this, and edit and re-edit. He had to get it out pretty much right, correct, what he meant to say the first time. So that, I think, mental gymnastics were his exercise, and I think he mastered that. But he could present such a sound argument, not only using logic and persuasion, but just the tone of his voice. And he carried such an authority that even if you vehemently disagreed with something he said, he made you rethink your premises. You'd have to go back and say, well, if Charles Krauthammer thinks I'm wrong, there's a pretty good chance I am. So let's go take another look at this. But it was just that weight of his intellect, which, I don't think was the most important thing. It made his career, obviously. It wasn't the most important or lasting aspect or impactful aspect of his personality.
James or Jonah?
I am a baseball fan, and I'd see Charles at the national games all the time. And Charles is a wordsmith, and it reminds me of something that Mark Twain said. He said, the difference between the right word and a nearly right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. And when it came to picking the right word, I think Charles is a 400 lifetime hitter. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's good. Jonah, any more?
Just a word about, the right, part of the reason why he could speak in these perfect crystalline paragraphs is that he had kind of a superpower. He'd been dictating his column for 40 years, and that's a muscle memory thing. And you learn how to speak in ways that most writers can only figure out with their fingertips. He had to do it with his mouth, and it made him, that's one of the things that made him so formidable. But, my favorite image of Charles was I was coming back from a friend's hotel room that I crashed at the 2012 Republican convention. Some bartender outrageously overserved me the night before, and it was about 6 a.m. and I'm horribly hungover, and all of a sudden I'm walking over this land pedestrian bridge thing, and I hear this whizzing sound, and I turn around, and coming out like a Japanese fighter pilot with a rising sun behind him is Charles Krauthammer. Had to be clocking 20 miles an hour in that wheelchair. And he loved to zip around in that thing. And the only problem was I joked with him, was like, you really should have an external speaker playing like Flight of the Valkyrie out of it, which he really liked that idea. He was a man in full. He could barely use any of his body except for one hand, and he was one of the most fully realized human beings I've ever known. And that's true whether you disagree with him or agree with him. He was just a completely well-rounded, grateful person, and I'll miss him terribly.
Now, Jason has a workshop at 5 o'clock for 40 minutes going against Peter Schiff and all the investment guys. So you want to just tease that workshop? What are you going to talk about?
Just some personal experiences and life lessons that Charles gave me along the way. If that's something you're interested in hearing about, and also giving me some questions that I can answer for you and some things you would maybe want me to talk about, I'm willing to do that as well.
Okay, I'll set up this last minute with Charles. It's the 2016 conference. The other two panelists had already talked about the election. P.J. O'Rourke was voting for none of the above, not even the Libertarian. Steve Moore was going to vote for Trump, and Charles Krauthammer was not voting for any of them, not even Trump or Clinton or the Libertarian. But Charles had great hope for America in this closing minute of his last message to this conference. Please run the tape.
In the 19th century, we needed a Lincoln, and we got a Lincoln. In the 20th, we needed FDR to get us through the Depression and the Second World War. In the second half of the 20th century, we needed Reagan to revive the country when it was deeply depressed and in retreat, and also in the midst of great post-Vietnam self-doubt, and he succeeded in doing that. Now, I don't stay awake at night praying for miracles and for a new Ronald Reagan. We're not going to get one. But I remain impressed by the fact that in American history, things generally turn. And to me, whether you believe it's the hand of God, to me it's the bedrock of decency, common sense, wisdom, generosity, and love of liberty of the American people. Churchill once said, Americans always do the right thing after having tried everything else first. Well, we have just spent 8 years trying everything else, and we may spend the next 4 years trying everything else. But I do believe that eventually we're going to get it right. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Charles Krauthammer.
Is that incredible?
And thank you to our panelists for a great panel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate it.
That was nice. That was great, Jason.